Number 11, on cruelty. It seems to me that virtue is something other, something nobler, than those tendencies towards the good which are born in us. Such souls as are well endowed and in control of themselves adopt the same gait as virtuous ones and, in their actions, present the same face. But the word virtue has a ring about it, which implies something greater and more active than allowing ourselves to be gently and quietly led in reason's train by some fortunate complexion. A man who, from a naturally easy-going gentleness, would despise injuries done to him would do something very beautiful and praiseworthy, but a man who stung to the quick and ravished by an injury could arm himself with the arms of reason against a frenzied yearning for vengeance, finally mastering it after a great struggle, would undoubtedly be doing very much more. The former would have acted well, the latter virtuously. Goodness is the word for one of these actions, virtue for the other, for it seems that virtue presupposes difficulty and opposition, and cannot be exercised without a struggle. That is doubtless why we can call God good, mighty, bountiful, and just, but we cannot call him virtuous. His works are his properties and cost him no struggle. Among the philosophers take the Stoics, and even more so Epicureans, and I borrow that even more so from the common opinion, which is wrong, despite the clever retort which Archelaus made to the philosopher who reproached him with the fact that many people crossed over from his school to the Epicurean one, but never the other way around. I am sure that is so, he said. You can make plenty of cocks into capons, but never capons into cocks. For in truth, the Epicurean school in no wise yields to the Stoic in firmness of opinion and rigor of doctrine. A Stoic who showed better faith than those disputants who to oppose Epicurus and to make the game easy for themselves put into his mouth things he never even thought of, sinisterly twisting his words and by the rules of grammar claiming to find other senses in his way of speaking and beliefs different from those which he showed in mind and manners, declared that he ceased being an Epicurean for this reason, among others, that he found the path too steep and unapproachable. And those who were called lovers of pleasure are in fact lovers of honor and lovers of justice, cultivating and practicing all these virtues. Among the Stoic and the Epicurean philosophers there were, I say, many who judged that it was not sufficient to have a soul in a good estate, well under control and ready for virtue, that it was not sufficient to have our powers of reason and our thoughts above all the strivings of fortune, but that we must do more, seeking occasions to put them to the test. They wish to go looking for pain, hardship, and content in order to combat them and to keep our words and fighting trim. Virtue gains much by being put to the proof. That is one of the reasons why Epaminondas, who belonged to a third school, rejected the wealth which fortune put in his hands in the most legitimate of ways, in order, he said, to have to fence against poverty, and he remained extremely poor unto the end. Socrates, it seems to me, essayed himself even more roughly to exercise his virtue. He put up with the malevolence of his wife, which is to essay yourself in good earnest. Metellus, alone among the Roman senators, undertook to withstand by the force of his virtue the violence of Saturninus, the tribune of the people of Rome, intent on forcing through an unjust law in favor of the plebs. Having incurred the death penalty which Saturninus had decreed for those who rejected it, he conversed with those who were escorting him to the fort in this extremity, saying that to act badly was too easy and too cowardly, to act well when there was no danger too commonplace but to act well when danger threatened was the proper duty of a virtuous man. Those words of Metellus show us clearly what I wanted to prove, that virtue rejects ease as a companion, and that the gentle easy slope up which are guided the measured steps of a good natural disposition is not the path of real virtue. Virtue demands a rough and thorny road. She wants either external difficulties to struggle against, by means of which fortune is pleased to break up the directness of her course for her, or else inward difficulties furnished by disordered passions and imperfections of our condition. I have got this far quite easily. But by the end of the above argument, the thought occurs to me that the soul of Socrates, which is the most perfect to have come to my knowledge, would be by my reckoning a soul with little soul to command it. For I cannot conceive in that great man any onslaught from vicious desires. I cannot imagine any difficulty or any constraint in the progress of his virtue. I know that his reason was so powerful and sovereign within him that it would never have even let a vicious desire be born in him. I cannot put anything face to face with so sublime a virtue as his. It seems I can see her striding victoriously and triumphantly along, stately and at her ease, without let of or hindrance. If virtue can only be resplendent when fighting opposing desires, as we therefore to say that she cannot manage without help from vice, to whom she at least owes the fact that she is held in esteem and honor. And what would become of that bold and noble-minded pleasure of the Epicureans, who prides herself on nursing virtue gently in her lap and making her sport there, giving her shame and fevers and poverty and death and tortures to play with? If I postulate that perfect virtue makes herself known by fighting pain and bearing it patiently, by sustaining attacks from the gout without being shaken in her seat, if I make her necessarily subject to hardship and difficulty, what becomes of that virtue who has reached such a pinnacle that she not only despairs pain, but delights in it, taking the stabbings of a strong colic paroxysm as tickling pleasures? Such was virtue established by Epicureans, of which several of them have left us by the actions proof which are absolutely certain. Passions to arm and tense oneself to halt their progress and to vanquish them, or that this second action is nevertheless more beautiful than to be simply furnished with an easy, affable nature, which of itself finds indulgence and vice distasteful, cannot, I think, be doubted. For this third and last manner may seem to produce an innocent man, but not a virtuous one, a man exempt from doing evil, but not one apt for doing good, added to which such a mode of being is so close to imperfection and weakness that I cannot easily unravel and distinguish what separates them. That is why the very terms goodness and innocence are somewhat pejorative. I note that several virtues, chastity, sobriety, and temperance, can come to us as our bodies grow weaker. Staunchness in the face of danger, together with contempt for death and patience in affliction, can come to men, if that is the right name for it, together with contempt for death and patience in affliction. Assessment of such misfortunes by a failure to conceive them as they are. A lack of intelligence or even animal stupidity can counterfeit virtuous deeds. I have often seen men praised for deeds which deserve blame. An Italian nobleman once spoke as follows in my presence at the expense of his nation. The subtlety of the Italians and the vividness of their minds are so great that they can foresee far ahead the dangers and mishaps that them, so that in war we should not consider it strange if we often find them providing for the safety even before reconnoitering the danger, whereas we French and the Spaniards, who were nothing like as subtle, would press on. We had to be made to see danger with our own eyes and to handle it before we took fright. Then there was no holding us. whereas the Germans and the Swiss, grosser and stolder men, scarcely had enough sense to change their ideas, even when they were being struck down. Perhaps it was said, for I laughed. It is nevertheless true that apprentices to the craft of war often leap into dangers more thoughtlessly than they do once they have been molded. I was not unaware of what can be achieved by a man coming fresh to battle, seeking glory and by the sweet honor of a first engagement. That then is why, when we make a judgment of any individual action, we must consider a great many circumstances as well as the man as a whole who performed it before we give it a name. Now a word about myself. I have sometimes seen my friends speak of wisdom in me when it was really luck, or attribute something to my courage and endurance when it was really due to my judgment or to my opinion, attributing one quality to me instead of another, sometimes to my advantage, sometimes to my detriment. Meanwhile, so far am I from having reached that first degree of excellence where virtue becomes an acquired habit, that I have hardly given any proof of the second. I have not made much of a struggle to bridle any of my pressing desires. My virtue is a virtue, or rather a state of innocence, which is incidental and fortuitous. If I had been born with a more unruly complexion, I am afraid my case would have been deserving of pity. Essays of myself have not revealed the presence in my soul of any firmness in resisting the passions whenever they have been even to the slightest degree ecstatic. I do not know how to sustain inner conflicts and debates, so I cannot congratulate myself much if I do find that I am exempt from many of the vices. If in my nature, which is otherwise straight, there are a few trivial vices, just as you might criticize an otherwise beautiful body for having a few moles, I owe that more to my fortune than to my reason. Fortune caused me to be born from a stock famous for its honorable conduct and from an excellent father. Did some of his humors flow into me? Was it the examples in the home and the good education I received as a boy which contributed to it without my knowledge? Was it due to some other accident of birth? I cannot tell. Was I born under the constellation of the balance, or was it dread Scorpio with violent power over the hour of birth, or was it Capricorn who rules as tyrant over the Hesperian waves? It is at all events true that of my own self I am horrified by most of the vices. The I am, I repeat, horrified by them, out of native conviction so thoroughly my own that I have retained the impulses and character which I bore away with me when I was weaned. No other factors have made me worse than them, not even my own arguments, which, since they have in some things broken ranks and left the common road, would readily license actions in me which my natural inclinations make me loathe. I shall be saying something monstrous, but I will say it all the same. I find, because of this, in many cases, more rule and order in my morals than in my opinion, and my appetites less debauched. That's my reason. Aristippus laid down opinions about pleasure and riches, which were so bold that the whole of philosophy rose and stormed against him. Yet where his mortals were concerned, when Dionysius the tyrant presented him with 3 beautiful young women to choose from, he said he would choose all 3, since things had gone badly for Paris when he preferred one woman to her 2 companions. But having escorted them to his home, he sent them away without laying a finger on them. And when his manservant found the load of coins he was carrying too heavy to manage, he told him to pour out as many of them as he found too heavy. Epicurus, too, whose doctrines are free from religious scruple and favor luxury, in fact behaved in real life most devoutly and most industrially. He wrote to a friend of his that he lived on nothing but coarse bread and water, asking him to send him a bit of cheese for when he wanted to give himself an extra special treat. Can it possibly be true that to be good in practice we must needs be so from some inborn all pervading property hidden within us, without law, without reason, and without example? By God's mercy, any excess in which I have found myself implicated have not been of the worst. In my own case, I have condemned them at their true value. Since my judgment was never infected by them, I have made the case for the prosecution against myself more vigorously than against anyone else. But that is not the whole story. Despite all this, I bring too little resistance to bear on them, letting myself readily come down on the opposite side of the scales, except that I do control my vices, preventing them from being contaminated by others. For unless you are on your guard, one vice leads to another, and most support each other. I prune my own vices and train them to be as isolated and as uncomplicated as possible. Beyond that point, I do not indulge my faults. As for the opinion of the Stoics, who say that when the wise man acts, he acts through all his virtues together, even though there is one virtue which is more in evidence depending on the nature of the action. If they then proceed to draw the parallel consequence that when the bad man does wrong, he does so through all his vices together, then I do not believe it to be simple, or else I fail to understand what they mean, for I know the contrary to be true by experience. Such are the insubstantial pinpoint subtleties which philosophy occasionally lingers over. Some vices I follow, others I flee as much as any saint could do, and the Peripatetics reject the idea of any such indissoluble interconnection and bonding. Aristotle maintains that a man may be wise and just yet intemperate and lacking in restraint. Socrates confessed to those who recognized in his physiognomy some inclination towards vice, that such was indeed his natural propensity, but he had corrected it by discipline. And the intimate friends of Stilpo, the philosopher, said that he was born subject to wine and women, but had trained himself to be most abstemious in both by study. Any good that I may have in me I owe on the contrary to the luck of my birth. I do not owe it to the law, a precept, or apprenticeship. Such innocence as there is in me is a unfledged innocence, little vigor, no art. Among the vices, both by nature and judgment, I have a cruel hatred of cruelty as the ultimate vice of them all, but I am so soft that I cannot even see anyone lop the head off a chicken without displeasure, and cannot bear to hear a hare squealing when my hounds get their teeth into it, even though I enjoy the hunt enormously. Those who have to write against sensual pleasure like to use the following argument to show that it is entirely vicious and irrational. When its force it at its climax, it overmasters us to such an extent that reason has no way to come into it. They go on to cite what we know of that from our experience of lying with women, as when the body already anticipates its joy and Venus is about to scatter seeds broadcast in the women's furrows, in which it seems to them that the delight so transports us outside ourselves that our reason could not possibly perform its duty then, being entirely transfixed and enraptured by the pleasure. But I know that it can go otherwise, and that, if we have to walk, we can sometimes manage, at that very instant, to bring our soul back to other thoughts. But we must vigilantly ensure that our soul is taut and erect. I know it possible to master the force of that pleasure, and I am quite knowledgeable about the subject. I have never found Venus to be as imperious a goddess as several people, chaster than I am, attest her to be. I do not regard it as a miracle as the Queen of Navarre does in one of the tales in her Heptameon. Not even a matter of extreme difficulty to spend nights at a time with a mistress long yearned for, in complete freedom and with every opportunity, while keeping my promised word to her to content myself with simple kisses and caresses. I think a more appropriate example would be that of hunting, when after a long chase our quarry suddenly pops up and reveals itself where we were perhaps least expecting it. The shock of this and the heat of the view hollow strikes us so that it would be difficult for those who love this sort of hunt to bring their thoughts at this point back to anything else. That is why the poets make Diana to trumpet triumph over Cupid's flames and arrows. Is there anyone who, in the joys of the hunt, does not forget the ills which love's care brings? To return to my subject, I feel a most tender compassion for the afflictions of others, and would readily weep from fellow feeling, if, that is, I knew how to weep at anything at all. Nothing tempts my tears like tears, not only real ones, but tears of any kind, in faint or paint. I scarcely ever lament for the dead. I would be more inclined to envy them, but I do make great lamentations for the dying. Savages do not upset me so much by roasting and eating the bodies of the dead as those persecutors do who torture the bodies of the living. However reasonable lawful public executions may be, I cannot even look fixedly at them. Someone, having to bear witness to the clemency of Caesar, wrote the following: He was so mild in his vengeance that, having forced surrender on the pirates who had formerly taken him prisoner and held him to ransom, he did indeed condemn them to be crucified, since he had threatened them with that fate. But he first had them strangled. His secretary, Philemon, who had tried to poison him, he punished with nothing severer than simple death, without my even naming the author who ventures to allege, as evidence of clemency, the mere killing of those who have injured us. It is easy enough to guess that he was shocked by the base and horrifying examples of cruelty which the Roman tyrants introduced. As for me, even in the case of justice itself, anything beyond the straightforward death penalty seems purely cruelty, and especially in us Christians, who ought to be concerned to dispatch men's souls in a good state, which cannot be so when we have driven them to distraction and despair by unbearable tortures. A few days ago, a soldier in prison noticed from the tower in which he was held that a crowd was gathering in the square and that the carpenters were at work constructing something. He concluded that this was for him. He determined to kill himself, but found nothing which could help him to do so but save a rusty old cart nail which fortune offered to him. He first of all gave himself two big jabs about the throat, but finding that this was not effective, he soon afterwards gave himself a third one in his stomach, leaving the nail protruded. The first of his gaolers to come in found him in this state, still alive but lying on the ground, weakened by the blows. So as not to waste time before he swooned away, they hastened him to pronounce sentence on him. When he had heard it and learned that he was to be decapitated, he seemed to take new heart. He accepted the wine which he had previously refused, and thanked his judges for the unhoped-for mildness of their sentence, saying that he had made up his mind to appeal personally to death, because he had feared a death more cruel and intolerable, having formed the opinion that the preparations which he had seen being made in that square meant that they wanted to torture him with some horrifying torment. This change in the way he was to die seemed to him like a deliverance from death. My advice would be that the exemplary severity intended to keep the populace to their duty should be practiced not on criminals but on their corpses, for to see their corpses deprived of burial, boiled or quartered, would strike the common people virtually as much as pains inflicted on the living, though in reality they amount to little or nothing, who kill the body and after that have nothing they can do, and the poets particularly emphasize the descriptions of such horrors as something deeper than death. O grief, that the remains of a half-burnt king, his flesh torn to the bone and splattered with mud and blood, should be dragged along in shame. I found myself in Rome at the very moment when they were dispatching a notorious thief called Catena. The crowd showed no emotion when he was strangled, but when they proceeded to quarter him, the executioner never struck a blow without the people accompanying it with a plaintive cry and exclamation, as if each person had transformed his own feelings to that carcass. Such inhuman excesses should be directed against the dead bark, not the living tree. In somewhat similar circumstances at the circus, tempted the harshness of the ancient laws of Persia. He ordained that noblemen who had failed in their tasks should not be whipped as they used to be, but stripped naked and their clothes whipped instead, and that whereas they used to have the hair torn out by the root, they should merely be deprived of their tall headdresses. These scrupulously devout Egyptians reckoned that they adequately satisfied divine justice by sacrificing swine in figure and effigy. It was a bold innovation to wish to pay in shadow and effigy God, whose substance is very essence. I live in a season when unbelievable examples of this vice of cruelty flourish because of the license of our civil wars. You can find nothing in ancient history more extreme than what we witness every day, but that has no means broken me in. If I had not seen it, I could hardly have made myself believe that you could find souls so monstrous that they would commit murder for the sheer fun of it, would hack at another man's limbs and lop them off, and would cudgel their brides to invent unusual tortures and new forms of murder, not from hatred or for gain, but for the sole purpose of enjoying the pleasant spectacle of the pitiful gestures and twitchings of a man dying in agony while hearing his screams and groans. For there you have the furthest point that cruelty can reach. That man should kill man not in anger or in fear, but merely for the spectacle. As for me, I have not even been able to witness without displeasure an innocent, defenseless beast which has done us no harm being hunted to the kill. And when, as commonly happens, the stag, realizing that it has exhausted its breath and its strength, can find no other remedy but to surrender to us who are hunting it, throwing itself on our mercy, which is implores with its tears, all covered with blood, groaning and seeming to beg for grace. That has always seemed to me the most disagreeable of sights. I hardly ever catch a beast alive without restoring it to its fields. Pythagoras used to do much the same, buying their catches from anglers and fowlers. It was, I think, by the slaughter of beasts in the wild that our iron swords were first spattered with warm blood. Nature given to bloodshed where beasts are concerned bear witness to an inborn prosperity to cruelty. In Rome, once they had broken themselves in by murdering animals, they went on to men and to gladiators. I fear that nature herself has attached to man something which goads him on towards inhumanity. Watching animals playing together and cuddling each other is nobody's sport. Everyone's sport is to watch them tearing each other apart and wrenching off their limbs. And lest anyone should laugh at this sympathy which I feel for animals, theology herself ordains that we should show some favor towards them, and when we consider the same Master has lodged us in this palatial world for his service, and that they like us are members of his family, theology is right to enjoin upon us some respect and affection for them. Pythagoras borrowed his metempsychosis from the Egyptians, but it was subsequently accepted by many peoples, including our Druids. Souls have no death, they live forever, welcome in new abodes, having left their former ones. The religion of our ancient Gauls included the belief that souls, being eternal, never cease changing and shifting from one body to another. In addition, the Gauls attached to this idea some concern with divine justice. They said that the soul which had made her home in, say, Alexander, there was ordained by God, depending on how much she had behaved, a different body, more painful or less so, according to her behavior. He compels those souls to accept the mute fetters of the beasts. The merciless are imprisoned in bears, thieves and wolves, cheats and foxes. Then, having driven them over many a year through thousands of shapes, he at last purges them in the waters of Lethe and summons them back to the original human shape. If the soul has been violent, she was lodged in the body of a lion. If a voluptuary, in a pig's; if a coward, in a stag's or a hare's; if cunning, in a fox's; and so on until, purified by such chastisement, she took on the shape of some other man. For I, Pythagoras, as I remember well, was Euphorbus, son of Pantheus, during the Trojan War. I do not attach much importance to such cousinship between us and the beast, nor to the fact that many nations, particularly some of the oldest and noblest, not only welcomed animals to companionship and fellowship with themselves, but even ranked them far above themselves, sometimes reckoning that they were the familiar friends and favorites of their gods, respecting them and reverencing them as above mankind, sometimes acknowledging no other god nor godhead but them. Beasts were sacred to the barbarians because of the blessings they bestowed. This region worships the crocodile, another trembles before the abyss, gorged with snakes. Here on the altar stands a golden image of a long-tailed monkey. In this town they venerate a river fish, in another a dog. And the actual interpretation which Plutarch makes of this era is to their honor, for he states that it was not the cat or the bull which the Egyptians worshipped. What they worshipped in those beasts was an image of the divine attributes. In the bull, patience and utility; in the cat, quickness; or like our neighbors, the Burgundians, as well as all the Germans, its refusal to let itself be shut in. By the cat they represented that freedom which they loved and adored above any other of God's attributes, and so on. But when among other more moderate opinions I come across arguments which essay to demonstrate the close resemblance we bear to the animals, and how much they share in our greatest privileges, and how convincingly they can be compared to us, I am led to abase our presumption considerably, and am ready to lay aside that imagery kingship over other creatures which is attributed to us. Even if all that remained unsaid, there is a kind of respect and a duty in a man as a genus which linked us not merely to the beasts which have life and feelings, but even to trees and plants. We owe justice to men, and to the other creatures who are able to perceive them. We owe gentleness and kindness. Between them and us there is some sort of intercourse and a degree of mutual obligation. I am not afraid to admit that my nature is so childishly affectionate that I cannot easily refuse an untimely gambol to my dog wherever it begs one. The Turks have charities and hospitals for their beasts. The Romans had a public duty to care for geese, by the vigilance of which their capital had been saved. The Athenians commanded that the hemules and the she-mules, which had been used in the building the temple named the Hecatomedon, should be set free and allowed to graze anywhere without hindrance. It was the usual practice of the citizens of Agrigentum to give solemn burial to the beasts they loved, such as to honor horses of some rare merit, to working birds and dogs, or even to those which their children had played with, and their customary magnificence in all things was particularly paraded in the many splendid tombs which they erected for that purpose. They remained on display many centuries afterwards. The places they embalmed their corpses and wore mourning at their deaths. Simon gave honorable burial to the mules which had thrice won him the prize for racing in the Olympic Games. In antiquity, Satypus had his dog buried on a coastal headland which has borne its name ever since, and Plutarch says that it offended his conscience to make a little money by sending to the slaughterhouse an ox which had long been in his service.